Hi, everyone. I'm Dina, Rasquinha, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography and the Integrated Conservation Program at the University of Georgia. So for my doctoral research, I study the reciprocal relationships between human mangrove ecosystems in India, specifically in Bhitarkanika Wildlife Sanctuary. And today I will be presenting some of my research that looks at how small scale pressures like firewood extraction can impact mangrove carbon services and how that relates to socio-cultural values of people living near these forests. So just to give you an overview, this is a brief outline of what I intend to share with you today. I will begin by giving some background on the different mangrove management or protection regimes in the country, and then dive into how that how that influences socio-cultural values of people living near these areas. Also, what that really means for the long-term sustainability of mangrove vegetation by presenting some results from my research. And as we all know, mangroves provide a wealth of services that support and maintain human communities around the world. Now, these include protection from storm surges and floods, nurseries and breeding habitats for a variety of terrestrial, estuarine, and marine fauna, and livelihood needs of local communities. They are also equally important from a climate mitigation point of view because of their carbon sequestration services. Mangroves can sequester a large amount of carbon, even more than terrestrial rainforests. And much of this carbon is stored in the form of in soil beneath the mangrove trees. So although carbon mitigation services seem very important in the current times, and rightly so, the irony is that people who live very close to these forests may or may not see them in terms of carbon. They associate these forests with a number of ecosystem services, such as a place where fish is plenty, fodder is plenty, the water is clean, their houses are safe, and they have wood, which is also for some form of carbon, but wood to build their houses, boats to fish, and also wood to cook their food. So where are these forests located in India, and how does that influence mangrove human values? Let's look at how protection areas are defined in India first, before diving into where these forests are found in the country. So in India, protected areas such as national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, etc., they're as shown on the map here in the form of these yellow polygons, a special zone set aside for biodiversity conservation. And apart from providing a habitat for threatened and endangered species, it is also important to note that these areas are not entirely isolated, but are embedded in highly human-dominated landscapes. Therefore, frictional relationships between officials and local people because of illegal extraction or human-wildlife conflict is often observed in such areas. So it's also important to note that rights and privileges of local people differ in each protected area. For example, in a national park, human interference from timber harvesting, fuel wood collection, or collection of minor forest products, as well as private ownership rights, is prohibited. Whereas these restrictions are waived off in sanctuaries as long as they do not interfere with the well-being of wildlife. We also see a very similar situation with most of the mangrove forests in the country. So India possesses about 3% of the world's mangrove forests, which are shaped by different press and pulse disturbances, such as sea level rise, coastal development arising from infrastructure projects like roads or tourism projects, as well as frequent tropical cyclones that impact these coasts and impact our coast annually. So in the country, these forests are distributed all along the west and the east coast and its islands. And much of the remaining large expanses of mangrove forests are found within, in protected zones within the country. Some of them are listed here. So it kind of becomes imperative to understand how these multiple zones of protection kind of accommodate, these multiple zones of interaction. And what does that really mean for conservation management and planning? So this kind of brings us to the dilemma of trade-offs. While some things are gained, others may be lost. So while advocating for different conservation interventions, the full range of possible trade-offs between human livelihoods and conservation may not be explicitly acknowledged or even discussed as interventions are sought, such as access to these forests is in itself a trade-off to many. Therefore, recognizing these trade-offs is important when we think of conserving these forests. So keeping this in mind, I ask how sociocultural values align with different mangrove ecosystem services, especially in protected areas, and how does that differ across genders and diverse stakeholders? So I kind of use Bhitarkanika Wildlife Sanctuary, which is located on the east coast of the country in the state of Odisha, as a case study. And partly because this area has a diverse land tenure system, it was under the zamindari system, which is an aristocratic way of collecting land revenue in the form of land taxes until about 1951. It was then declared a wildlife sanctuary in 1975, and then a national park in 1998. That's the core zone of the park, which is this area. So, but only in 2002, it was also recognized as a Ramsar wetland site because, the high diversity of mangrove flora found in this region, as well as, a number of endangered species of, fauna found here. And these include crocodile species. It also accommodates the largest nesting area of the olive ridley turtle and numerous bird assemblages. Now, although this area seems a little isolated from many of the largest cities of the state, it is heavily populated and surrounded by about 400 villages and thousands of inhabitants. Even then, people here live a self-sufficient life owing to paddy fields. This is a paddy field here. Small kitchen gardens, backyard ponds, an example of a backyard pond where they rear fish, for their consumption. They also work on shrimp farms. This is an example of a shrimp farm, and also collect firewood for their cooking needs. It's important to note here that firewood is usually supplemented with alternate sources of energy like cow dung, rice husks, etc. But it is still a very integral part of the cultural landscape here. So in order to answer my question, I used a mix of quantitative and qualitative approaches. So to understand harvesting pressures on these forests, we assessed how vegetation composition, structure, biomass, and carbon stocks vary in areas where harvesting is practiced and where it is not. We sampled a total of 26 plots, each measuring about 10 by 10 meters within 7 sites across the sanctuary that represented varying degrees of human access and use. You can read more about the methods and our results in detail by referring to the paper, which was recently published. If you need a copy, please feel free to email me. Then to understand how sociocultural values align with mangrove conservation narratives, a combination of survey and interview methods were used. We essentially a traditional survey that tried to capture gender differences in firewood collection patterns was utilized, where a total of 170 participants were asked if they collected firewood for cooking, and if they did, whose job was it. We also used a pile sorting exercise where participants placed statements in piles of 3, those that they agree with, those that they disagree with, and those that they don't particularly have an opinion to share. So a list of 30 statements were presented to 41 participants. These were usually local experts, like members of self-help, certain self-help groups, or leading forest communities, etc., but also included participants like NGO staff, forest officials, researchers that have worked in this area, and so on. The sorts were then analyzed to highlight the spectrum of similarities and dissimilarities between people's responses. So this is example of the 30 statements that were used. As you can see, the topics covered, ranged from ecosystem services of mangrove forests, livelihood opportunities, relations with forest officials, and so on. And just to give you an example about livelihood opportunities, this one year talks about how shrimp farming provides livelihood opportunities and if it's a good source of income for households or no. So participants were essentially asked to, if this statement was presented, participants kind of put the statement in piles of whether they agreed with or disagreed with, or they had a neutral stand. So let's discuss some of these findings to understand how different sociocultural values and harvesting pressures in this area influence mangrove sustainability in the region. So a traditional survey is investigated how much firewood was collected and who does the collection to get an idea about the harvesting pressures in the forest. So this bar graph here summarizes the number of people broken down by gender who agreed that firewood is indeed used as a fuel source for cooking. And among the total individuals that were surveyed, 61% agreed versus 40% denied that they use firewood for cooking. So among the pile that agreed, 89% suggested that women are primarily involved in the collection of firewood. Also, while important to note here is that while consumption patterns vary, the average value per monthly consumption usually stood around 25 kgs, because firewood is almost always supplemented with other forms of fuel sources. And then to understand how harvesting pressures actually impact the mangrove forest structure, composition, and carbon stocks, we looked at harvesting patterns across, we looked at, how these factors varied across harvested areas and non-harvested areas. And we found that overall, the number of mature trees, saplings, and seedlings were lower in harvested areas than in non-harvested areas. Similarly, we also found, as you know, this is the plot that shows that, individuals were lower in harvested than non-harvested plots. Similarly, we also found that the proportion of total carbon stocks was lower in harvested areas than in non-harvested areas. And that trend kind of stayed the same for both above ground carbon stocks as well as below ground carbon stocks. But when we looked at species differences, we found some interesting results. We found that sites where harvesting was common were largely composed of a mix of species types. You can see this graph here. And these were largely dominated, and also these areas were largely dominated by the presence of, say, Avicennia officinalis, as well as Soneraceae, a number of Soneraceae species. Whereas non-harvested areas showed a strong presence of Exocaria and Heritier forms with a number of other rare species. So some key takeaways from the slide here are that harvesting can not only influence carbon stocks of the forest, but also impact the ecological integrity. If you look at this plot here, we see that a number of mangrove associates like, say, Pongamia and Sapium indicum were also found in harvested areas, whereas those were absent in non-harvested areas. So non-harvested areas showed much more presence of true species, mangrove species, than mangrove associates. So this is important to keep in mind. Now, briefly looking into how these different harvesting pressures coincide with socio-cultural values. We used a number of survey methods and interview methods to understand people's views towards mangrove conservation narratives. So we found that that the traditional the pile sorting exercise revealed three distinct perspectives. And when they were compared with interview responses, they provided greater insight on how people value these forests. So the three perspectives comprised aspects of livelihood security, conservation value of mangrove forests, and a strong sense of place. So the statements that loaded significantly on the first perspective spoke of how shrimp farming was seen as a lucrative opportunity, as well as the growing migration of village folk to cities in search of jobs. The second described the immense storm protection value of mangroves, as well as other ecosystem services. And the third perspective, covered aspects of self-identity and emphasized that the sanctuary was their home and they didn't see rehabilitation and relocation packages as an option. And like I mentioned, if you correspond these statements with interview quotes, it kind of gives you a deeper insight into how people value these forests. So for example, this quote here talks about how people recognize the risk involved in shrimp farming, um, but yet they feel that it is a lucrative opportunity that provides livelihood security. Then the second quote here talks about how how deeply people value storm protection services of mangroves. Then coming to how people, whether local people's views aligned with other stakeholders, we just compared how different perspectives, which participants reveal different perspectives. And we found that if you look at this graph here, each bar represents the different group of participants. So A and B refer to male and female villagers respectively. C relates to the officials from NGOs, D government officials, and E researchers or academics that have worked in this area. So one of the key takeaways again from this slide is that stakeholders such as researchers, NGO workers, and government officials dominated perspective two, that's conservation value of forests, whereas the other two factors, that's livelihood security and strong sense of place, were dominated by villagers. And you can see, factor one, F1 and F3 are loaded significantly on A and B, whereas they show lower loading strength on the rest of the stakeholders. So as mentioned previously, women mainly collected firewood and were involved in activities that didn't contribute to household income, whereas men were the sole breadwinners of the family. Now, these differences in responsibilities brings out certain subtle differences in how men and women perceive and value the forest differently. For instance, when asked if quantity and quality of firewood has declined over the years, men kind of denied the use and insisted that they actually use cylinders now and it's actually improving, whereas women kind of reflected and said that we don't cut trees, but we only use dry wood. So it kind of has to do nothing with the quality or quantity of the forest. Similarly, some of the responses also indicated an embedded cultural significance of cooking food, especially rice, using firewood. So when presented with, say, compensation schemes in exchange of firewood collection, men were more open to adopt these schemes. However, women often pause to explain that everyone prefers eating rice cooked on the traditional chulhas. Similarly, both men and women found food or preferred food that was cooked on wood-fired cook stoves. So just to summarize and whatever we just discussed, we found that harvesting patterns show both ecological degradation and low carbon stocks, but kind of have some potential for conservation opportunities. We also found that women are primarily involved in forest extraction activities. And therefore, it's kind of crucial for conservation plans to be inclusive of communities' lived realities, and so involving women and other marginalized communities in decision making is needed for successful outcomes. We also found, value perspectives differ among local and extra local interviewees, which brings us to the discussion that, on the surface, exclusion kind of assumes a reduction in people forest interactions when use still continues. And this is not to say that protected areas are not successful in conserving forests. They work because they have been operational for years in the country, but combining alternate inclusive plans can help them help them be more successful. For example, community managed woodlots can be an option where communities have access to these areas to sustain their needs and also have the ability to manage these areas without interference. And lastly, to note is that people were interested in incentive-based programs for towards mangrove conservations, but they also exclaimed that while these incentive-based programs were needed, people, officials should recognize their lived realities. So that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed my talk. And if you have questions, please feel to get in touch with me. My email ID is mentioned in the last slide here. And just before wrapping up this talk, I'd like to acknowledge different people who've contributed in different ways. Towards my research, and without whom or without their help and guidance, it wouldn't have been possible. So yeah, thank you. And please email me if you have questions. Thank you.